again. I am Robert Doc Barham, and you're listening to American Dream Time. And today, our guest is Mr. Tom Shroder. He is an author and specifically a writer of a book titled Old Souls. Tom, welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm actually sitting here across the desk from Tom, and I have been, I guess I've been haranguing him on and off over the past several years. I loved your book. I really thought it was a wonderful, wonderful book.
Oh, thank you.
And I have told many, many, many people about it. And if you wouldn't mind, would you share what you believe the book to be about?
Oh, yeah. Well, when I'll just say how I came to write it. I think that will explain it. I was the editor of Tropic Magazine, which was the Miami Herald Sunday magazine, and this was back in the 90s. And there was a psychiatrist at the big hospital there, Mount Sinai Hospital on Miami Beach, and he became famous because he wrote these books about how he had been hypnotically regressing his patients to previous lives. And the guy's name was Brian Weiss.
Brian Weiss.
Yeah, and he wrote a book called Many Lives, Many Masters. Uh-huh. And, you know, as a journalist, I always looked out for stories that, you know, seemed to approach things from unexpected directions. And the unexpected direction here was this very well thought of, very serious and credentialed psychiatrist who had sort of become this new age guru, you know, focusing on this, what, you know, seemed like this outlandish idea that people could reveal past lives just from being hypnotized. So I decided I wanted to do a story on him. And, you know, he was a really nice, smart guy, but I was very unimpressed with his cases as evidence for reincarnation because, you know, in doing the story, I had myself regressed hypnotically also.
You did? Okay. Yeah. Where were you when you went through that hypnotic regression?
Miami.
You were in Miami?
Yeah.
At his office?
No, I found somebody who did it,
okay.
You know, in the area.
Okay. A hypnotherapist to do the regression hypnotherapy.
Yeah. And you know, and the hypnosis process struck me as it was just like going into meditation. You know, you tried to relax your mind and your body, and then the hypnotist is inviting you to imagine things, you know, inviting you to visualize. And so, you know, I thought, sure, okay, I'll do it. So I came up with some stuff, and it was not at all, it didn't strike me at all as getting anything real. It was more like, you know, when I was trying to write a short story, you know, sometimes if you're writing a short story and you really get into it, it seems like your characters talk to you. Uh-huh. Almost as if you're not really coming up with it, that the characters are. Well, it was that same sort of feeling where I was definitely relaxed. I was definitely going with the flow mentally, and I would come up with characters, and I never for a moment felt that it was touching anything actual. But that was just me, okay? So then he had these patients who recalled previous lives in great detail, only none of them really supplied any information that they couldn't have gotten from reading historical novels or just out of their imagination. And there was nothing that really sort of, you know, and if you're looking at it from the outside and you're trying to decide, is this real or is this just their imagination? What you're looking for is some kind of specific details that matched with a reality that they couldn't have possibly known, okay? And he just didn't have that. And sometimes the cases that he cited as being really good evidence, the people contradicted themselves within their memories. You know, like at one point they'd say, I couldn't see the date. I don't know what date it is because I can't see a newspaper. But then at another point, they're giving specific dates just sort of off the top of their head. Or they said that they were, a Babylonian handmaiden at the same time as, they had at the same time in history as they were claiming they were something else, so they couldn't have had two lives at once. But anyway, there was no, what I would say was evidence, objective evidence that these were anything but fantasies. But in my research on doing this, I came across a guy named Dr. Stevenson, and he had spent 30 years traveling the world investigating cases of very small children who began talking about things that sounded like previous lives. And he was fascinated by this, and he decided that he was going to go and investigate these cases and find out, were they obvious frauds? Were people putting words in these children's mouths and stuff? But he started this out 30 years earlier, and he began finding all these cases, many more cases than he thought he was going to find. I mean, he went there with some newspaper reports of cases or cases that just appeared in bits and pieces elsewhere, and that he found once he got on the ground, people were saying, "Oh, I know, my cousin recalled a previous life," and many of his cases were in countries where there was a religion that did believe in reincarnation, and these children would remember things that later turned out to sync perfectly with the lives of dead strangers, people that they had no way of knowing. And because they were children, unlike adults, they had very limited access to information. So it was much easier to sort of rule out many of the sources of information that could have given them information about the past. And so, for instance, one kid he was with recalled the life of a guy that loved to hunt. And he said, well, yeah, and he described the house, and he gave names so they could identify a guy that didn't live many generations early. He lived in the previous generation, just very short time before the kid was born. So they went to the house that he was able to describe and to locate, and they go in the house and nobody's living in it, and they're looking around, and he said, I used to keep my guns there, and he pointed at a blank wall. So Stevenson knocked out the wall, and sure enough, there was a gun rack behind it had been plastered over.
And at that moment, let me have you pause, if you wouldn't mind. I want to read from the Wikipedia on Old Souls. It says, Old Souls, the subtitle is The Scientific Search for Proof of Past Lives. It's a nonfiction book by journalist Tom Shroder, an editor at the Washington Post. Shroder traveled extensively with psychiatrist Ian Stevenson of the University of Virginia, so UVA just down the road. And he conducted past life and reincarnation research in Lebanon, India, and the American South, meaning the American United States South.
Yes, yeah.
Right. Schroeder's journalistic experience makes this book a valuable review of an oft-disparaged subject. Stevenson's informants were 3,000 children spontaneously remembering recent ordinary lives as opposed to adults remembering under hypnosis romantic or heroic lives in the distant past. In addition, birthmarks that occur at the site of injury in the previous life constitute an important part of Stevenson's evidence. So, did Dr. Stevenson, because I don't recall that in the book, or this in the
birthmarks?
No, not birthmarks. Did Dr. Stevenson ever engage in hypnosis or work with folks who did regression hypnosis?
No, well, I'm sure he probably did, but that might have been completely separate from. He didn't hypnotize these kids.
Yeah.
No, this was strictly through interviewing the children and their families and witnesses to things the kids had said or done, or the families of the previous personalities, he called them, the dead strangers the kids appeared to be remembering.
Right. Now, if I remember, Dr. Brian Weiss is a psychiatrist, and he's since gone on to write a series of books on He's continued that work. I think he may be retired now, but he has written 6 or 8 other additional books since Many Lives, Many Masters. With Dr. Stevenson, though, you did actually travel with him to these different
Yes,
countries.
I spent a month with him in Lebanon and a month with him in India. And then, I had many trips to Charlottesville and around Virginia doing some cases, American cases as well.
Now, in the United States, the general opinion of reincarnation is what would you say?
Well, it's skeptical, at least. Many people, there are a lot of Stevenson's critics. They didn't really criticize his cases. They just said reincarnation is an absurd idea. Therefore, there's no point in paying any attention to these cases at all. And I thought that was a non-scientific attitude.
Okay.
It was like a priori deciding that this couldn't be true. Therefore, we're going to ignore whatever evidence he digs up.
That sort of thing, like you just mentioned, that mindset is something that throughout the history of science, I think most of us in getting educated about the history of science have heard that sort of thing, which is we don't want to look at this information because we don't believe it in the first place. So
one time that it's in the book, but it's also burned into my memory is, when we were in India and it was late into my association with him. By that time, I'd traveled with him in, 2 continents and spent a lot of time with him. And we were driving in the Indian outback somewhere, in a rickety old van, and we're sitting in the back seat, and he starts to kind of despair, and about. And he starts asking me, why won't any scientist take this seriously? And he was like asking me that, And then he said, at one point he said, science only changes one funeral at a time. And what he was talking about there is that there gets to be this orthodoxy in scientists who are supposed to be only pay attention to the evidence and to never inflexibly decide that there's one truth and that truth is completely unchangeable. It's the opposite in science. A truth is always changeable by new evidence.
It's always amendable,
right?
Updatable.
However, there are people who become very sort of well-known scientists and begin to dominate the discussion, and they can become attached to their theories and their positions, and they could not want to pay attention to any new evidence, to, just say, well, that's absurd, I'm not going to even bother.
Well, speaking of evidence, your story that you were talking about earlier, which is taking out a wall, and there was...
the gun rack.
Right. Yeah. Now, were you there?
No, that was a story he told.
Okay. And when you heard that story, what was your impression?
Well, okay, so I needed to regard Stevenson skeptically too. And I remember the first trip I made with him to Lebanon, I remember sitting in the flight lounge in Paris waiting for the flight to board that went to Beirut. And he came by and talked to me briefly, but he was in first class and I was traveling coach. And so the whole way to Beirut, it's a 4-hour flight, I was thinking, boy, what if it turns out that he's transparently either a fraud or crazy or just foolish, and that these cases are just bogus? Then I don't have a book. Nobody wants to read a book of just saying, never mind. But as soon as we landed, I knew that wasn't the case, that he was very serious, very sober, that these, and when we started talking to these families and these children, they didn't care. They weren't like, one theory is, these people wanted attention, or they wanted status in their community,
or perhaps money, or
right,
whatever.
Right. And they didn't care. They were doing us a favor by talking to us. And they were clearly just recounting something that was part of their experience that they believed to be the truth. And and they would say, they'd say, well, okay, the life I remembered, the kids, and they'd give all the statements. Like one kid remembered the life of a mechanic, who just died in a car accident because his friends got in a road rage argument with somebody and started racing after them, and the guy drove the car off into a ditch.
This is the story about the convertible?
Yeah. And so that's the other thing is a lot of the hypnosis cases are remembering glamorous lives or the lives of people who were famous, or people who were important. And so that's another explanation is that people want to fantasize about something to, aggrandize themselves, But clearly, this was just an ordinary schmo,
Schmo, you mean like you and I?
Yes.
Schmoes like
right.
us.
Or as Joan Osborne would say, just a slob like us, like one of us.
All right.
And he just got killed doing something stupid.
So can I insert?
Sure, of course.
If I remember that story, they were driving too fast and the car flipped over.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And because there was no top, there was a convertible, one of the people was thrown from the vehicle and ended up landing on his head.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And then now later on, there was a boy who claimed to be the reincarnation of that man who died?
Yes.
Okay. Can you continue telling me?
Yes, and so we met him in their apartment, and at this point, Stevenson had interviewed him a year before, so at this point he was in his early 20s. And, and he said that actually there was the guy that was driving the car, he said that he met him, that guy was still alive, and he met him and he said that, he was really angry with him when he met him because he was blaming him for this accident,
right.
Even though it was a previous life.
There is actually in that story, does that boy, if I remember correctly, come up and say something like you are responsible?
Right, yeah, absolutely. Once he talks to the guy, and the guy just sort of, puts him off. But
so can you imagine that? Can you imagine if this story is actually true? Let's for a moment assume that this is a real story. And by the way, I'm going to interrupt myself because as far as stories go, I'm sure that our listeners might be wondering a little bit about you because we are talking about a topic that for many people, they are skeptical, at least, like you said. And it says on Wikipedia that Tom Shroder is the author of The Most Famous Writer Who Ever Lived, A True Story of My Family, an investigation into the life of his grandfather, Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist McKinley Cantor. Acid Test, LSD, Ecstasy, and the Power to Heal, which was released in 2014, and about the resurgence of research into the medical use of psychedelic drugs. Ghostwriter of the New York Times bestseller, The Operator, Firing the Shots That Killed Bin Laden and My Years as a SEAL Team Warrior by Robert O'Neill. Co-author with John Conrad of Fire on the Horizon, The Untold Story of the Gulf Oil Disaster in 2011, and sole author of Old Souls, Scientific Evidence from Children Who Remember Previous Lives, published back in 1999, based on the work of Canadian psychiatrist Ian Stevenson. So now we know a little bit more about you, and there you are, this story that you're writing about, which I found that to be one of the most compelling stories in the whole book, which is where the boy actually says to the man, you're at fault. You're the reason that I ended up died. You drove too fast. I told you not to drove too fast. Now look what happened to me.
Yeah. Well, there's another story that really impressed me was by the time I met her, she was a young woman, also in her early 20s, but when she was a very little girl, before she could even really form full sentences, she would be grabbing the phone off the hook in her family's home and crying into the phone, "Layla, Layla." And the parents would say, "What are you talking about? Why are you doing that?" And as she began to talk better, she says, "Well, that's my daughter. And I'm trying to talk to her." And then she started telling her story. And her story was that she had a husband and she had 3 daughters and she had all these uncles And she named them all, and she said, and I lived in a town. The town was maybe 50 kilometers from where she lived now. And so she gave enough evidence, enough facts, that they sort of talked to people about it. And people in that town they knew said, well, there is a family by that name. And the mother died. Actually, she had been flown to Virginia for a heart operation that she didn't survive. And so word got around, and the grown daughters of this woman heard that there was this little girl claiming that she had been their mother in a previous life. And so they made an unannounced visit just to check this out. And these were wealthy, very sophisticated family, and they were skeptical about reincarnation. They didn't really, believe in it or anything, but they were a little spooked by the stories of what this girl was saying, and so they show up at the house unannounced. And the first thing the little girl says, who's like, I think 6 or 7 at the time, is she calls them by name and she says, "Finally, you've come." And then very early in their conversation, she said, "Did your uncles give you the jewelry as I asked them to?" And that totally floored them, because only their family knew that in the hospital, before the surgery, her brothers were there. And she said, "Look, if I don't make it, I want one daughter to have this and that jewelry and the other one to have this and that jewelry." So, there was no way, they felt there was absolutely no way that the little girl could have known that, much less, called them by name and recognized them.
Now, you started this project originally in sort of one mindset, right?
Well, I think my feeling has always been that what I believe in is science, and what science does is it gathers evidence, and then it evaluates the evidence, and it creates a theory that accounts for the evidence. And then it gathers more evidence and tries to make predictions with that theory. And if the predictions come true when they gather more evidence, then that gives you more confidence that the theory is accurate. But you never have 100% confidence that a theory is accurate.
Toward a proof.
A theory, yes. A theory can work extremely well for all the known facts, but then as new facts come in, maybe it doesn't work quite as well. And the perfect example of that, of course, is Newton's law of gravity, which worked spectacularly well for everything that humans do and can observe on Earth. But when you start, exploring the cosmos and finding situations where things are moving at close to the speed of light, or there's like huge gravity, like the gravity of a sun 100 times larger than our own sun, then suddenly it doesn't work so well. And that's what science does, is it keeps gathering more information. So, I felt like, okay, I'm willing to, this is intriguing enough, and I think it's worth investigating. Unlike a lot of mainstream scientists who never bothered to check out his cases.
So let me ask you to pause for a moment there.
Howdy, I'm Dr. Paul H. Smith, Stargate remote viewer and lead trainer for remote viewing instructional services. We are listening to American Dreamtime, the Robert Doc Barham Show. Thanks for listening, and be sure to tell your friends to listen too.
If I ask you a question, and the question is, and this is not meant to be facetious at all, what is the value in your mind? Because it has you listed as, amongst other things, an investigative journalist of sort, right? Mm-hmm. What is the value of that kind of open-minded but skeptical attitude, mindset, in general in life, do you feel?
Well, I think it's the only way to get as close to the truth as is humanly possible to get.
How do you think that affects human relations?
You mean having that mindset?
Yeah.
Well, I would think that it would make for good human relations, because you're not prejudging things. You're not sort of operating on preconceived notions that may or may not be true. So I think, you're open to, if you're going to be successful in life, you have to deal with reality. And the only way to deal with reality is not to sort of close it off before you experience it. So I think that, I think for all things, that's the way to approach things.
So if I could go back to another section of Old Souls, if I remember correctly, in that story with the little boy who remembered being thrown from the vehicle, the convertible, there was later on, if I remember, did he not say that he knew some of the family members from previous lives?
I'm not following your question.
I think what I remember is that he went back to some folks who, did they not take him back to the people who were supposedly his actual parents in the previous life?
I know that in a lot of cases that the children who remembered these families reconnected with the families of their previous personality and developed lifelong relationships with them. There is
that's really interesting.
Yes. And in fact, well, for instance, there was a boy, and this was actually a new case for Stevenson while I was there, that he was interviewing this kid for the first time. And he remembered being part of a militia group in Lebanon Civil War, which had, I think, just ended like 7 years before we were there. And he remembered being at this sort of artillery emplacement of this militia group. And, it wasn't like a formal military. He was like this 19-year-old kid who was helping out in the neighborhood artillery emplacement. And he got killed in a bombardment. And actually, this was a bombardment from a U.S. ship who was offshore bombarding the hills of Lebanon because the government, the Christian government in Lebanon, had convinced the U.S. that there were a bunch of Syrians up in those hills, which was not true. So the ships were laying offshore and they just started blasting the hills. And he got killed in this bombardment. And he described the guy and his circumstances to the point where it identified a specific family, and that family met him, and they kind of adopted him. And so when they had a funeral or something, he filled the role of the eldest son, even though their other sons, their surviving sons, were much older than he was.
So that's a true story.
Yes, and he was connected to them. And I asked him, I said, well, I mean, do you still feel like Fadi? Fadi was the name of the guy that died, of the 19-year-old that died. And he says, well, I was Fadi, but now I forget what his name was right now, but now I'm me, because, this is my new life. So he understood that, but, he identified that he was, but anyway, I majored in anthropology in college.
Okay.
And anthropologists are all about kinship relationships. And if you were an anthropologist studying the Druze in Lebanon, you would really have to create a kinship category that was past life family because, he was part of their rituals and they accepted him fully as the reincarnation of their dead son.
Now, what are the major religions that are in that area?
Well, these were Druze, and Druze are the ones that have belief in reincarnation.
Right.
But and people would say, well, okay, well, aren't they coming up with these stories just to kind of reinforce their religious beliefs, And isn't that why there are more cases in Lebanon and India than there are in the United States? Well, and I would say, well, wait a second. If you're saying that the belief in reincarnation was enough to create false cases of belief, then isn't the disbelief in reincarnation enough to suppress possibly real cases in this country? you can't have it. You have to go both ways on that one.
Well, we certainly have examples in history of this country and other countries where people don't express themselves in particular and specific ways because it's not acceptable in society.
Absolutely. And in fact, there are a lot. And now when, it's reincarnation is sort of more widely known and heard of here, there are an awful lot of cases. You mentioned a story in the Washington Post recently, and a reporter named Caitlin Gibson had, she just put out a call that was around Halloween. And she had put out a call for parents to tell them what spooky things their kids had said. Well, a large portion of the stories she got were about kids remembering previous lives. So it's something, and some of the stories were really spooky. Like, one girl who always talked about, about all the cats and the lady that lived in the blue house, and and the mother didn't know what to think of it. And then her husband came in and she was telling her husband this. She says, "Oh, well, I had an aunt who had a ton of cats, and she lived in a blue house that's now torn down, not far from here." So this was just like a random thing where she put on Facebook, "Parents who have kids remembering weird things, tell me about them."
Now, there are, I'm going to go back again, and I'm not doing it because part of our theme is past lives, but I would like to go back again. What I recall in Old Souls at one point was where a mother says that she had been sewing or knitting a sweater for her son.
Right.
And I believe it was the son who was thrown from the car.
Yes.
And then can you tell the rest of that story about what she did with the sweater?
Well, she took it out and finished it and gave it to him.
Right.
Made it big enough for him.
Right. So she was making a sweater for her son from one life.
Right. And he died.
And he was, not a child.
Right.
And then this little boy who she met and believed that he was her son, as I remember, she went upstairs.
And she accepted it, and she took out and she
reknit it for the little boy and gave it. I thought that was just the most poignant, sweetest story.
See, another thing that people would say is, well, they just want the comfort of thinking that their loved one, their dearly loved, departed, are back. Which is a very, it's one of the strongest human emotions. And I remember I was coming back from one of the trips, and I was on a train from Heathrow, and I remember the train slowed and stopped, and it was right by a cemetery. And there were these grief-stricken people standing, by an open hole. And it just struck me how powerful that urge is, to not want death to be the end of your association with somebody. And so, yes, that's a huge motivation, and it could create false belief in people that somebody had survived. But then there are always these cases that sort of counter that. The case of the little girl I mentioned who remembered the jewelry that she wanted her daughters to have. We went to that. We visited the family of where the grown daughters were, and they didn't want. And also countering the idea that people are in it for attention, they didn't want to talk to us. They said, their uncles gave them a hugely hard time the first time this came out in the papers when the little girl was like in her 7, because they did business with people in Saudi Arabia who, where reincarnation was anathema. It was, almost like a devil worship type of thing in their opinion, and so it really embarrassed them in their business relationships. So they wanted nothing to do with this. So they didn't even want to let us in the door. But the dead woman's husband, who is an old man now, sort of really wanted to talk to us, you could tell. And he sort of took us aside and said, "My daughters don't know this, but I still talk to her. She still calls me. When she was little, she called him like 3 times a day for a while. And he said, and just the other week, in fact, I told her, please don't call me anymore. And it wasn't because I didn't want to talk to her, but it was because I felt that she was stifling her own young life now, her new life, and that she didn't have a boyfriend or anything. And he felt that it was getting in the way. So just sort of in a self-sacrificing way, he was saying, go live your own life, forget about me, which I was very touched by. And then the daughters said, I said, well, wasn't it at least reassuring to know that this little girl was, possibly your mother? And they said, no, it was scary and spooky that here was this little girl, knowing things that only our mother can know. That wasn't reassuring. That kind of creeped us out. And she said, and yet we can't deny that she knew things that only our mother could know.
Now, there are other religions that do still hold on to the idea or the concept of reincarnation, are there not?
Well, I mean, in India, the Hindus certainly believe in reincarnation.
Now, do the Buddhists as well?
Yes. But the other thing is if you're thinking that they're creating these cases to conform to their religious beliefs, it's interesting that in the Druze, one of the main things that they believe about reincarnation is that it happens instantly upon the death of one person, that the soul enters a child being born at that exact moment.
So at the moment of death, the soul transmigrates to
right.
the
But of course,
soul.
None of the Druze cases, the children remembered lives of people who were born from weeks to years before they died. Before they were born.
Now, I did go and in part because I found this topic to be a fascinating topic. And to be honest with you, I found your book to be amongst the most readable and enjoyable books that I've read in this particular category of past lives. And that's not to disparage anybody else's books. I just thought it was a heck of a well-done book.
I think there's just a difference in approach, and that most books that I've read about these kinds of things start off from the position of this is true. So like I said, they're presupposing that this is true, and so that when they're citing these cases, they're all just matching what they've already decided is reality. Whereas I went into it saying, I don't know if this is true or not, but let's look at the facts as closely and reasonably as we can. And I still don't know if it's true. What I do know is that in the 25 years since I wrote the book, nobody has come up with a really good explanation of the fact that around the world, all over the place, there are this category of children who just spontaneously start saying, I used to be so-and-so. I used to live in this. I used to live in a house that looked like this. I used to have 3 dogs and a cat, And that happens, and it's undeniable that is not an uncommon phenomenon. That is actually a fairly common phenomenon. And to get back to the idea of, how you can suppress these cases, my son used to say, when I was a daddy, and I treated it as a grammar problem. I instantly said, no, what you mean is when you're going to be a daddy. And after a while, he stopped saying it. So, who knows? Maybe he had a whole, maybe it wasn't a grammar problem. Maybe he was remembering a previous life and I hindered him from coming out with more of it.
Well, now, when I invited you to be on the program, one of the things that I did do is I know that you have, like most of us, an appreciation of science and its value, and science is that it's at its core and its intention is to ascertain the fact or truth of reality as best it can, to verify that, to generate theories, to test those theories, replicate those theories in order to try to create a theory that is accurately a map of reality, so to speak. I think that's probably one way of saying it. Now, one of the things that I sent to you in an email was an agreement for you to be honest in the course of our conversation. And there's I'll get to the reason why I ask you to do that. One of the things that I found fascinating with Dr. Stevenson's work is that he was someone who cataloged what were supposedly marks that may have been correlated to past lives. Is that correct?
Yeah, birthmarks, yeah.
So in the case, if we go back to the case of that young man in Lebanon who who was thrown from the car, I believe he had a mark, did he not?
Yes, I remember, remember this is 25 years ago that I wrote this, but I do remember a case more clearly that had a very dramatic birthmark. And it was a man who as a child, remembered the life of a guy who had been murdered, a successful merchant in a town not far from where he lived. And the guy had been sitting on his patio having breakfast when this I think a mentally deranged man shot him, and the bullet entered through one cheek and exited the other. Uh-huh. And he almost choked on his tongue, which had been severed, on the way to the hospital. And he later succumbed to his injuries.
It was severed because of the bullet?
Because of the bullet.
Because of the bullet, okay.
Right. And this guy, this young man now had he had a puckered scar on one side, and then another scar right almost exactly where you would expect it to be. Not a scar, a birthmark, an odd-looking birthmark on either side of his cheek that matched the bullet. And we even went and got medical records that showed the autopsy report that showed where the bullet entrance and exit wounds were. And there wasn't a perfect match, but it was within millimeters. And Stevenson said, well, when you grow, your facial structure changes from the time you're born, obviously. So that could account for the slight difference in location. So maybe that could explain it. But you have to maintain your skepticism, and you have to look at other possibilities. And one possibility would be that this kid was born with weird birthmarks that he
correlated.
That he later encountered the story about this guy who was shot in a way that would have matched his birthmarks. So he suddenly had this identification, and that somehow he learned about this guy's life. And that to me that sounds a little far-fetched, because he had other details of the guy's life that would have been very hard for a little kid to know.
Now, this Dr. Evans and Stevenson, he conducted this research at. He was based out of the University of Virginia?
Yeah, he had been the head of the Department of Psychiatry. But then when he got into this, it embarrassed the university, basically. So they basically made him step down from being the head of psychiatry.
Do you recall who was funding?
Yes. In fact, he might have been out of a job entirely, except that this guy named Chester Carlson, who had invented xerography, gave $1 million because he was interested in this subject. He had a personal interest in it.
The inventor of Xerox xerography?
Yes, yeah. And he heard of Stevenson's work, so he funded. So they had independent funding for this institute, and that was really what kept them going. But even his first wife, Stevenson's first wife, was embarrassed by this. And she would go to she was very status conscious, and she really liked being the wife of the head of the Department of Psychiatry, but she didn't like it so much when she went to cocktail parties and people would sort of obviously, deride the kind of work that he was doing. And she kind of felt he was throwing his life away on it. Well, she died, and he remarried a much more supportive woman, fortunately for him. But he paid personal cost for this. But he felt that he was pursuing something important.
He did, though. He did create something that I think today is still considered to be the world's largest database of this sort of.
Oh yeah, he had. I think at the time I did it, they had about 3,000. Case reports of three, and they were in various states of completion. Some of them were just cursory accounts that they had come up with, but others were like the ones I was going to see involved, many interviews and trips all over the place and collection of documents. One thing that I really enjoyed doing was on the case about Kadeji, the mechanic who died in the car accident. He had the young boy, as a boy, had described the car accident in detail. That was one of the main subjects of his memories. And Stevenson had never really gotten any kind of official account of it. So one day we went and spent the morning looking through the morgue of the various Beirut newspapers, and we were like digging through microfilm. Before the internet, of course, that's how they kept records of old newspapers. And we're going through reel after reel after reel, and suddenly the woman, his assistant in Lebanon, a woman named Maj, said, "Look, here it is." And there was a newspaper account of this accident, which was, and the funny thing you said was that in the newspaper accident, it wasn't a convertible; it was a sedan.
Ah.
So there was a difference. But on the other hand, if the top gets torn off, it's a convertible. But the account really matched very closely. And of course, newspaper accounts, especially in a situation like an automobile accident in a small newspaper or whatever, the account itself might not have been 100%.
Well, certainly newspapers print retractions,
right.
Make mistakes.
But it was it was so close that, it would have been very hard to imagine that, that this kid invented this whole cloth.
Now, at the University of Maryland, where Dr. Stevenson was.
No, Virginia.
University of Virginia, thank you. Where he was, it's the Department of Perceptual Studies. Is that correct?
Department of Personality Studies.
Personality Studies?
Personality. And the reason, he said the reason they named it that was, they said, so they don't know about the high-stakes gambling in the back room. It was kind of a cover story, really. They wanted a bland title because they didn't want, to attract the kind of attention of nuts or people who were, not really taking science seriously.
Who are some of the other folks that you worked with there? You mentioned.
Well, he had a successor named Jim Tucker,
Dr. Jim Tucker,
who I think is retired just recently.
Uh-huh.
And then there were other researchers around the world who there was a woman named Antonia Mills, and there were a few other researchers around the world who did similar things to what Stevenson's does. I mean, we worked with a psychiatrist in India, a woman named Satwant Pasricha, who was doing his kind of work there as well. And, of course, she was valuable because she could speak the local languages and translate for us.
Now, Dr. Bruce Grayson is also an author of a book similar to yours and to Dr. Jim Tucker's books that are on this topic of past life. Is that correct?
Yes, and he was at the Department of Personality Studies, I believe.
I see. Now, where are you at these days? Because you said a couple times earlier in the conversation that the book was published 25 years ago.
Well, that's the question
What's been going on?
That's the question I've gotten most in the last 25 years. And in fact,
what I mean is, how did it affect you?
Right.
How has
I'm saying that's the question I've been asked most often. And in fact, recently, Simon & Schuster came out with a 25th anniversary edition of the book. And there's a 5,000 plus word afterword that is all about that question. And I say in it that you could think that maybe I should be able to answer that question in a sentence or two. But in fact, it took me over 5,000 words to answer that question. And the reason is because I don't feel the need to make a final conclusion about anything. I think we live in a mysterious universe, and I'm not unhappy with not knowing the final answer to everything. And I think that if we told ourselves we knew the final answer to anything, we'd be lying.
But it certainly is an awful big universe.
Right. But I think that really what I realized was that what happened was right before right when I was thinking about writing this chapter for the 25th anniversary edition, I got an email from a guy who says that he remembered the life, as a child, he remembered the life of a man who was murdered when his little children were playing in a neighborhood park. And these older boys came and started really beating them up seriously. So he came and he threw the older boys off the little boy, his little boys. And he was walking back with them, holding hands, and he was jumped by these other men and stabbed repeatedly. And he said, and he remembered the last thing he remembers in that life was being thrown into a thorn bush, bleeding, and that feeling the pain of the thorn bush, and then he expired. And he told that story, and it matched exactly the story of a family who had lost their father that way. And so he met the family and knew it. And he said, I want to know, whether you believe it's in this or not. And he says, because I don't need to, I know it's true because I experienced it. And I realized that, for the people who were telling these stories, it was real to them. And I realized that I had a kind of, it wasn't about reincarnation, but it was about another similarly impossible thing that nonetheless occurred and that I experienced, where, I was one of those things where I was in a state of emotional turmoil and I was sort of at my wit's end. And for the first time in my life, I just had a clear voice in my head saying, I'll wait for a sign. And then within a minute, the most unlikely and completely relevant sign appeared. And there was somebody with me, so they witnessed it too. And I had said to them, I'm going to wait for a sign. And then the next second, the sign appeared. And we were in a campground in the middle of nowhere. It was like 60 miles south of the Grand Canyon. The campground was completely empty. It was midnight. And suddenly this van appears out of nowhere. And we had been talking about the song by Bruce Springsteen called She's the One that I was saying it represented this whole sort of path in life that I was scared to take. And the van drives up right, and there's 3 camping rings, and it drives through the first one, the second one. We were in the furthest ring. The van comes, and they were all empty. And the van comes all the way right next to us. The door slides open, and that song is coming off the speakers.
Yeah.
And then it stops in the middle of the song, and the door closes, and we don't hear anything more from them. Okay, so that happened.
Uh-huh.
And I said, well, okay. And I asked my friend, what did you make of that? And he says, well, it was like a 1 in a million or 1 in a billion, maybe, coincidence. But in life, we have a billion moments. So odds are that in all those billion moments we have in life, maybe there'll be one moment with a 1 in a billion coincidence. And I said, yeah, well, maybe, but it just seems too weird to me. And then years later, a similar thing happened in a very significant moment in life. And for only the second time in my life, I said, I'll wait for a sign. And then a sign just as bizarre as that instantly appeared. So, okay, people can say, well, you're making more of it than it really was, or, you know, you have a false memory or whatever. But I know it was real, and I know that I wasn't making more of it than it really was. So I thought, well, wait a second. I mean, so what do I believe? What force in the universe could create these things to happen? And I have no clue, and I don't have no explanation for it. And physics cannot support anything that could possibly take something internally in me and produce a van and a song or whatever. So I thought, so these people who remember past lives are in the same situation. There's nothing in physics. I mean, now people try to say, oh, well, what about quantum mechanics? Well, they don't know what they're talking about. Quantum mechanics has nothing to do with the possibility of a soul being transferred from one body to another, or even what is a soul. You know, we don't even have a working, meaningful definition of that word. So I said, you know, so I understand the argument that even 1 trillion to 1 shot, even 2 billion to 1 shots happening, you know, at these moments were the only time I've ever asked for a sign, could possibly just be coincidence. You know, in fact, you know, there's no explanation for how they could come about other than coincidence. Well, and yet I can't believe that there's coincidence. So I feel like the people who experienced a previous life memory, that it's the same for them. So I have to say, hey, I think that there's more here than we'll ever understand. And if you think about having like a dog, do you have a pet or a dog or anything?
I've had pets.
Okay. Well, imagine trying to teach your dog calculus. What are the chances that a dog could ever completely understand a calculus equation?
It didn't work as well as I thought.
No. Right, exactly. So why would we think that the humans would have any more chance with the ultimate realities of the universe than a dog would have with calculus? I mean, why would that be different? So I just feel like, you know, that we're never going to know the ultimate answer, and that I'm okay with that. But I also want to understand as much as I can. So I'm always want to be open to listening to, you know, whatever evidence comes my way or that I can find through searching.
Well, and on that note, at searching, because I think that you're right, that the search in a universe this large will probably continue on for quite some time. I want to thank you for being here today. I really enjoyed the interview, and I hope you did too. And I also want to, while we're here in the last minute or so of the program, to invite you to come back and to talk about another fascinating topic, which is another one of your books called Acid Test, LSD, Ecstasy, and the Power to Heal.
Oh, I'd love to.
I would love to have you back. It's another fascinating topic. And if folks would like to find out more about you or know where you are on the web, if they would like to follow up with questions or things like that, how can they find you?
Yeah, well, I have a website, tomshroder.com.
tomshroder.com.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Tom, we are at the limit for today. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks,
We
Doc.
look forward to seeing you again. I'm Robert Doc Barham, and this is American Dream Time. We'll see you again soon.
Well, that was great. And in fact...